the way it started was Hugh, who was then just finished being my tutor at Middlesex Poly, as was. He had had a go at the Gong Show at the early days of the Comedy Store. Loved the vibe of it and this sort of scene that was beginning to happen, which then became known as alternative comedy. But didn't like the bear pit side of things. So he found this room, lived locally at the time, and wanted to put a gig on to try and have a sort of more supportive, friendly atmosphere. And asked me to come in and help on the admin side, because he's entirely incapable of doing anything of that. So that was our first ever gig, was down here in the depths, in the bunker as it was called, Comedy in the Bunker. It wasn't being used for anything. It had a sticky old carpet. It had just been changed over from I can't remember what it was called, but it was a lunchtime rotisserie, and it was an awful room. But like now, the club works in spite of the awkward shape of the room, and now, after 30 odd years, the comedy's in the walls.
So there weren't any comedy clubs in London at that time. So how did you set about finding acts?
There were a few that were sort of sitting on the back of the Comedy Store principles and the way they'd kicked off. There was the Earth Exchange, and then soon afterwards, the early Jongleurs, Meccano Club, the Red Rose, and Roland and Claire Muldoon were doing New Variety up at Wood Green. So it was a small, group of performers who were starting to work the circuit. It was very much more variety in those days. It wasn't straightforward comedy, so you'd get good singer-songwriters, a lot of acts coming off working the street, and a lot of people from the sort of European clowning circuit, those sort of things. I've been looking through old diaries recently. You've got a lot of the early Paul Martin, who became Paul Merton, and Clive Anderson, those people who were already doing the Comedy Store gigs at that time.
Crouch End has almost become the kind of capital of comedy in London, isn't it? It's like a ghetto, almost. You can't walk down the street without seeing a comedian, can you?
It's because comedians aren't bright enough to travel, and they get trapped here. They can't work out the fact there's no tube, so they just come here and they stay.
After 30 years, what is it that keeps you coming back here on a Thursday night, on a Friday night, on a Sunday?
I know.
What is it? What is it?
My wife says the same, although she's quite pleased for me to leave the house, I think. Genuinely, it's two things. One is that we actively look for new performers and nurture and encourage and develop. And we give the space to do that on the Thursday nights. So we can be ahead of the curve, really, by spotting people who we think in 2 years' time will be ready to be working professionally and fully working. And secondly, and this sounds crass, is I get a genuine pleasure from seeing an audience leave at the end of the evening having had a good night. Just part of that. And for 2 hours, you've made them or let them forget all the rubbish in their lives.
What's the gig that you enjoy most at the moment, in terms of, you do the tryout night?
The most important gig for me every week is the tryout night. You will see 14 acts doing 5 minutes, many of which may be the first and or last time they ever go at it. But that's always fresh. There's things always changing. And, the fact is that we continue to move people up the ladder. Whereas I think one of the reasons why some of the bigger clubs, like the larger sort of clubs around the country that have relied on large group bookings and food deals and disco afterwards, they haven't really invested in the next generation, so they've been having the same pool of people repetitively. We're always moving onwards, and so it's always fresh.
Some of the acts that I know that have done the tryout night have said to me that you're very supportive and that you actually give them feedback after the gigs. Is that right?
I've kept notes. We've been running the tryout night every Thursday since 1986. And I've kept notes for myself, not for them, on every act who's ever played here on every show. Just a few sentences like, needs to make more eye contact, or the material's better than the performance. You know, stuff for me to keep an eye on how people are moving forwards. That's my retirement. I'm going to publish all of those notes. I know at least 7,000 people will want to see what I've written.
So sometimes when someone walks onto the stage for the first time, you immediately get that they're going to be...
It does happen.
But
sometimes you can tell it as they walk through the door.
But how often have you been wrong? How often have you looked at someone and thought, this guy's never going to make it, and they've turned out to be...
It's the other way round. I've more often thought this guy or girl has got the potential, and it's never been shown, and there's a retrograde movement. The other way doesn't happen because I think it's important to fail as many times as possible. So if people go down the toilet here, I'm not going to say you can't come back. Come and have another go. 2 people in 30 odd years I've told not to come back, and they needed psychiatric help.
Is it like a psychiatrist's couch almost for some people?
It's Dr. Showbiz, isn't it? It's just nice to feel wanted, and there's nothing better than the big laugh, the one that really hits. So you come back for that each time. There is a lower rung of the ladder really on the circuit of a lot of people who patently don't really want to progress and don't want to learn the business, but they're quite happy at work to say by night I'm a stand-up comic and play to the same rooms in front of the same 6 friends and other comics doing the same thing. You know, there's a place for that. If somebody's playing here, I want to feel that they want to move up the ladder, you know, and develop and learn.
A lot of comedians say that this is their favourite club. What is it, do you think, that makes it, that gives it that particular vibe compared with the other clubs in the UK?
It's got a lot of the classic things. Low ceiling, of course it used to be very smoky. It's a bit scruffy. It's got something in it that's just been here for years and will always be here. It's just an old school comedy club, and there's no disco afterwards, and we actively discourage large groups. So the show is the thing here.
Do you ever have to throw people out?
Yes, occasionally. Usually drunk or chemicals, and it's very rarely a group. It's partly because we don't encourage groups. It's usually 2 or 3 people who actually don't know why or how they got here.
The backstage area is completely unique, isn't it?
Well, that's where the real comedy happens, in there. You shut the door and then you hear what I'm saying about the acts.
Because it's almost like a little club in itself, isn't it? The lighting box.
Yeah, it's the sound room, and it's in the most ridiculous place in a room. Normally, mixing sound, you'd be in front of the speakers, left and right. But we're stuck to the side there. It's partly because I can keep an eye on who's coming in or out of the door then. You asked if we chuck people out. Very rarely, because I can usually nip it in the bud at the door. My radar's good for people who shouldn't be in here. Usually it's the people who just throw the money down as they come in.
So it's probably true to say that most of the comedians that most people will have heard of will have started their careers down there.
It'd be hard pushed to find anybody who hasn't started out here, and a lot come back. I forget until people release their autobiographies that they'll say, "Oh, this was the first paid gig in London," or whatever. Lee Mack or Alan Carr in their last 2 books. I didn't know that, and suddenly it's there in a chapter, and they've got a soft spot for us.
So whenever you buy an autobiography of a comedian, do you immediately go to the index?
I don't buy them. I look at them in shops. We've been around long enough to be part of the scene now. And we punch above our weight for a small room.
And the fact that this is a small club is what makes it so intimate, isn't it?
Yeah. You can get 100 people in here, but it's comfortable, and everybody gets a good view, and the atmosphere's great.
So final question, how long are you going to carry on doing this?
Well, we reckon, I'm fairly sure of this, that we're the oldest comedy club still in its original home. We're outdated by a couple of others who have since moved once or twice. And we intend being the last comedy club in its home. I think we'll be going long after the others have gone.